Good afternoon. It is Wednesday, April 1st, and this is our daily video reflection for the Lebanon Lutheran Co-op during this time of social distancing and stay-at-home orders during the coronavirus pandemic. Being a Wednesday, the fifth Wednesday in Lent, today is the fifth and final installment of the series we've been doing this year for Lent on the spirituality of different witnesses down through the history of the Christian tradition. Today we will be examining what it means to follow Jesus with Mother Teresa, or as she is now known, Saint Teresa of Calcutta. The woman that we know as Mother Teresa was born Agnesa Bajagiu on August 26, 1910, to Albanian parents living in Skopje, Kosovo, in what was then the Turkish Empire. By the age of 12, Agnesa, who was being raised by her widowed mother and her sister, had felt a sense of calling to religious life, and throughout her teen years that sense of calling grew stronger. And finally, in 1928, at the age of 18, she left home to join the Sisters of Loreto at Loreto Abbey in Ireland. She intended to go to Loreto for long enough to learn to speak English, and then once she became fluent in English, to go on to a life as a missionary in India. English was the language of instruction that the Sisters of Loreto used in their convent schools in India, so she needed to be fluent in it. After a year at Loreto in Ireland, she moved to India and she began her novitiate in Darjeeling, India. And she began her novitiate as a teacher in a convent school. She took her first religious vows 2 years later in 1931, and she chose the name Teresa after Teresa of Lisieux, the patron saint of missionaries. She took her solemn vows in 1937, which were sort of her final vows, at which point she became known as Sister Teresa, while she was teaching at a convent school run by the Sisters of Loreto in Calcutta, India. She remained at that school in Calcutta for almost 20 years, becoming its headmistress in 1944. While she was there, she became deeply disturbed by the amount of poverty that she saw around her in Calcutta. And while she was en route from Calcutta back to Darjeeling for her annual retreat, which is something that many Catholic religious do, is take an annual spiritual retreat to reground themselves in their spirituality. She was on her way to her annual retreat in the fall of 1946 when she heard the voice of Christ calling her to, as she put it, leave the convent and serve the poor while living among them. She prayed about this sense of call for a long time, spoke with her superiors and her spiritual advisors in the Sisters of Loreto about it. And in 1948, she left the convent, left the school where she was headmistress, received basic medical training at Holy Family Hospital in Patna, India, and then began her work in the slums of Calcutta. She founded a missionary school in the Motijil section of Calcutta, which was an area at the time marked by really appalling poverty. And in the course of founding this missionary school, she began to work reaching out to the needs of the poor around her, their medical needs, their physical needs, and of course their spiritual needs. She was soon joined by a group of 12 young women and began to lay the foundation for a new religious order that in time would come to be called the Missionaries of Charity. This was not an easy calling for her, this calling to go and live in the slums of Calcutta among the poorest of the poor. Many times in those early years, she reported feeling a strong temptation to go back to convent life, to what was relatively comfortable and safe and secure and easy, being headmistress of a school, living in a convent, not living among the very poorest of the poor. She resisted that temptation and applied to the Vatican for permission to begin what's called a diocesan order. So it would be a new religious order, but only within the Diocese of Calcutta. She received that permission in 1950, permission to found a diocesan congregation that would care for, in her words, the hungry, the naked, the homeless, the crippled, the blind, the lepers, all those people who feel unwanted, unloved, uncared for throughout society. From this point, things really started to move very quickly for Teresa and for this diocesan congregation, what became known as the Missionaries of Charity. In 1952, she opened her first hospice, the Collegat Home for the Dying. It was free to the poor and was founded specifically to give people the opportunity to die with dignity and with adequate care. With help from some civic officials in Calcutta, she turned an abandoned temple into a hospice home, one of the first of its kind. Residents were given medical attention and the opportunity to die with dignity, and to do so in accordance with the dictates of their faith. She did not feel the need to proselytize the dying. Muslims were read to from the Quran. Hindus received holy water from the Ganges River. Catholics received the last rites. The aim of this hospice was to care for people where they were, to give them the opportunity to die surrounded by love and with basic dignity. Not long after this first hospice was opened, she opened another, which was the first home and hospice specifically for people with leprosy, which was rampant in India at the time. And that home and hospice was called City of Peace. 3 years after opening the first hospice in 1955, she realized that the sisters had taken in so many poor and orphaned children that something needed to be done. And so in 1955, she founded the Children's Home of the Immaculate Heart for orphans and homeless children in the slums of Calcutta. From there, her work with the Missionaries of Charity continued to grow and expand, always with this focus on living among and working with the very poorest of the poor. The order began to spread to other parts of India and eventually to other countries, and finally around the world. By the time Mother Teresa died in 1997, the Missionaries of Charity had grown from those original 13 women to over 4,000 sisters in over 500 missions and in over 100 countries around the world, ministering to orphans, AIDS patients, refugees, the blind, the aged, alcoholics and addicts, and the homeless. And she was even doing that work right here in the United States. Over the decades, Mother Teresa and her work was recognized and became famous. In 1979, she was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize. And in her address, when she received the Nobel Peace Prize, she challenged the leaders of the world and the people of the world to exhibit the same care for the poor and for the vulnerable in our midst. In 1985, President Reagan presented her with the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 1982, she actually brokered a ceasefire between the Israeli army and Palestinian guerrillas in Beirut. And once the ceasefire took effect, she went with a convoy of vehicles through the war zone of Beirut to rescue 37 children who were trapped in a frontline hospital by the fighting and to bring them out of the battle zone to safety. Mother Teresa's work was recognized by many people, including various popes, various world leaders, and she really became a global ambassador for the poor and the vulnerable in countries all over the world. When the former Soviet Union began to break up, when the Eastern European nations began to come out from under the yoke of communism, she expanded her missions into those places as well. Mother Teresa lived a very simple life, and in 1997, after a couple of heart attacks and a bout of pneumonia, on September 5th, 1997, Mother Teresa died, just 5 days short of the 51st anniversary of what she called the call within the call, when she got that sense of calling to enter into missions among the poor in Calcutta. By 2007, 10 years after her death, there were over 5,000 sisters, 450 brothers in the Missionaries of Charity, working in 600 missions and in 120 countries around the world. 10 years after that, in 2017, she was canonized by Pope Francis as Saint Teresa of Calcutta. I give this biographical sketch of Mother Teresa because to understand her spirituality, you really have to understand her story. And her story was marked by her spirituality. I think the first key part of Teresa's spirituality was a sense of vocation, a clear sense of divine calling for all people, and especially for those called to religious life. And within that, a sense of calling and command by Jesus to care for the poor and the vulnerable. She lived out that spirituality with a sense of attentiveness and submission to that calling in her own life. And it continues to mark the Missionaries of Charity to this day. Those who are accepted into the Missionaries of Charity as either sisters or brothers take the standard Roman Catholic religious vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. But they also profess a fourth vow, to give wholehearted free service to the poorest of the poor. That sense of calling to be of comfort and of help to the very poorest and most vulnerable in our world was at the very core of Teresa's spirituality and, unsurprisingly, marks the order that she founded. A second key aspect of Teresa's spirituality and what it meant for her to follow Jesus is the idea of love in action. For Teresa, it was impossible to speak of loving someone without putting that love into action and responding to their needs. For Teresa, this was an inherently lived spirituality. She chose to leave the safe and secure life that she had as a schoolmistress living in a convent to move into the very poorest slums of Calcutta, to live among the people God had called her to serve, and to shoulder their burdens with them, to take on their suffering, and to respond to it in whatever ways she could. That sense of love in action is summed up in a quote from Mother Teresa, in which she wrote, "What a trust it is for God to place suffering people in our hands. It is a sacred vocation for us all. Sacred because each of them is a life that God has created in God's own image. Today in this world, God has made us to be His love and compassion. We become his love as we pray, and we come to see his face in the lonely eyes of others. For Teresa, there was no separation between the command to love and the call to serve. A third aspect of Teresa's spirituality was that it was lived out in humility. She often in her life expressed a concern that there was too much focus on her and not enough focus on Jesus, who ordained and empowered the work of the missionaries of charity. She often expressed concern that her life might in some way be obscuring the importance of Jesus. And in fact, that's why she asked that her correspondence be destroyed after she died, because she didn't want it to overshadow what she felt was the true witness of the missionaries of charity. That sense of humility came through in many of her writings and her speeches and her lectures and talks around the world. One of the better known quotes from Mother Teresa is, "We can do no great things. We can only do small things with great love." One that is not as well known, but that I think is even more powerful, came just a few years before her death when she was asked during a question and answer session how she felt about some people calling her a living saint. She laughed and sort of shook off the notion that she was a saint. And then she answered, "If I ever become a saint, I will surely be one of darkness. I will continually be absent from heaven to light the light of those in darkness on earth." Those words were the embodiment of Teresa's sense of humility, that the work that she didn't grow out of her own particular holiness or ability or even faithfulness, but was given to her and empowered by Jesus Christ, and that it was only in obedience to that call that she was able to do anything. The fourth, and I think perhaps the most important aspect of Teresa's spirituality was her strong sense of perseverance. I mentioned a minute ago that Teresa wanted her correspondence to be destroyed when she died. That didn't happen. And in 2007, 10 years after her death, a large collection of her letters were compiled and published against her wishes. And in reading those letters, there was a great deal of shock and even dismay for the world, because in her letters, Teresa described a long period of profound spiritual dryness, of what John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, what Martin Luther called the hiddenness of God. She wrote to her confessors, to her spiritual advisors, to close confidants of her continual feeling of the absence of God rather than God's presence. In fact, with the exception of a period of about 5 weeks in 1958, where she once again felt the closeness of God, that period of spiritual dryness for Teresa lasted almost 50 years. It's important to note that this was the same 50-year period in which Teresa was founding and growing the missionaries of charity. This sense of spiritual dryness came almost exactly at the same time that she began the great work of her life. Think about that. All of the work that Teresa is so famous and so revered and so loved for was done during a time when she herself felt a profound sense, not of the presence of God, but of the absence of God. Teresa's spirituality is one of perseverance in answering God's call, even and especially when it is difficult, when answering that call does not bring a sense of closeness to God, but separation from God. When Teresa's letters were published and it became known that she had struggled with this long sense of the absence of God, with doubts and fears, many people viewed that as a sign that perhaps she was not the saint that people made her out to be. I think just the opposite. I think the fact that Teresa struggled so mightily with that sense of separation from God, that sense of the absence of God, and yet continued to persevere in faithfulness to the work that God had called her to. That is where her sainthood lies. In closing, I'd like to leave you with what Mother Teresa had printed on her calling cards. A gentleman who had come to visit her, sort of laughingly, had made her some calling cards that simply said on a yellow card, Mother Teresa. She took the cards, and on the back of them she began to write a few lines. And over time, those few lines on the back of her card became her signature, her calling card to the world. And those 5 lines are this: the fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. The fruit of service is peace. May Teresa of Calcutta and her living witness of faith, of love, of service, and of peace be an inspiration for us all. May God bless you and keep you this day and always. Amen.